And first of all, can I very much thank our sponsors, PwC, for their help in bringing this event to you. So I think one of the definite takeouts of the referendum campaign was that the British public want to have more control over immigration. There's obviously a chance with the prospect of Brexit to rethink the UK's immigration policy and a need to design and implement a new immigration system. So what we want to do today is not to focus on the merits, so the economics of immigration, does immigration add to GDP, not add to GDP, or whatever. What we actually want to do today is to answer some slightly different questions. One about is actually how should the government go about making this decision about what a new immigration system should look like, and actually what are their real options? So how can they construct a new immigration system? What is actually feasible? Because we all know that systems that you put in place in theory don't necessarily deliver in practice. You have to be able to implement those. So we've got a hugely experienced panel of real experts on immigration who are going to try to shed light on some of those questions today. So I am going to introduce them. First of all, on my far right, I have Madeleine Sumption. Madeleine's director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. She's expert in visa policy on the role of migrants in the Labour market, she said. That wasn't good, was it? In the Labour market. So that's Madeleine over there. That's an interesting separate debate, actually, isn't it? But anyway, so Madeleine, I know, has all the facts about migration at her fingertips. Then we have Mark Harper, the Right Honourable Mark Harper. Mark is the Member of Parliament for Forest of Dean and was Immigration Minister. So he was the person signing all those letters on immigration cases, dealing with the nuts and bolts of what was going on in the immigration system. He did that job between 2012 and 2014. So we'd like to have Mark to give us his perspective. Then, and slightly confusingly, we have my namesake, Jill Rutter. For the people who don't believe there are really two of us, there are, and this is the other Jill Rutter, as I so charmingly call her when people ask me to give my opinions on migration. So this is the Jill that does know about migration. She's Director of Strategy and Relationships at British Future. British Future is a think tank which aims to promote the positive aspects of immigration and integration. And finally, I have Mehmet, who's Vice Chairman of Migration Watch. Migration Watch, many of you will know, is an independent think tank that's been calling for action on migration for really quite a number of years. It's called for sustainable levels of net migration of under 100,000 people a year. Before joining Migration Watch, Alp was in the UK diplomatic service. His final posting was as ambassador to Iceland in 2004 to 2008. And finally, and joining us on the far left, is Lindsey Barras. Lindsey is a director of PwC Legal and a specialist in immigration law and board member of the UK Institute for Migration Research. So those are the expert panels. So the format we're going to use today is slightly different from our normal format. We're not going to have any opening statements from the panelists, but we've got questions which we've sort of crowdsourced in advance in a question time moment. And we're going to look at those questions under three sections. So the first section is, how do we decide on the UK's future immigration system? So how does the government go about making this decision? What should condition those decisions? The second one, which we're going to spend most time on, is what are the legal and administrative options for reducing immigration? And the final one is, I think, quite an important one, given the lessons of the referendum, which was, how do we go about engaging the public on whatever decisions we make? Given that I think one of the lessons of the referendum campaign was quite a disconnect between the views within a few miles of SW1 and maybe the views in the rest of the country about the impacts of migration, etc. So we're going to try and do those in those three sections. We will definitely end at 10:15, as promised. We have got a lot of questions, so not every panelist is going to be able to answer every one. So I'm going to direct them at the panel members, but then somebody really, really needs to say something immediately, then they can come in. And after each section, we'll give you a chance not to ask further questions, but to add in your own comments and perspectives. I know we've got lots of different sources of interest and perspectives. And then if panelists really need to come back, we'll do that very, very briefly. Otherwise, we'll never get to the final questions, which are quite interesting. So our first question is going to be, which hopefully will flick up on the screen, is how do we decide on the UK's future immigration system? So it seems slightly appropriate to give that question first to a politician. So Mark, you know, you've got your colleagues sitting there in the cabinet committees thinking about these issues. So what do you think the trade-offs are that they need to take into account when they're designing a new immigration system?
Well, Jill, thank you. I think the first thing, you can't really avoid the question you said we weren't going to talk about at the beginning, which is what contribution immigration makes to the country and the economy, because otherwise you have no way of working out what balance should be. Just very briefly, though, you also can't look at immigration as one lump of people coming to the country. You've got to look at the different routes and the different reasons people come to Britain. So the biggest number of people are coming here to work, both from inside and outside, or from inside the EU. The biggest number coming from outside the EU are coming to study. You also have to look at people who are coming for family reasons, and you also have to look at those who are applying for asylum and who make successful claims to be refugees. And you have to look at all of those, and they're all different. So just briefly, on work, you clearly need to look at what's required for the economy. You have to look at the labour market, and you have to look at the skills in our labour market currently available and plans that we might have for skills in the future. One of my arguments when I'm challenged on how would we reduce immigration without damaging the economy is that there are very significant numbers of people. There aren't a very significant number of people who are unemployed who currently have the skills and who are currently given opportunities. There are a very large number of people who could be in the labour market who I think the government could do more to help, but also employers should be more open-minded about. And I'm thinking of people with disabilities. There are hundreds of thousands of people with learning disabilities who could work and who want to work, and employers should be willing to give them an opportunity. And there are lots of people, for example, who have mental health problems who are not currently given an opportunity to work, and we're currently spending a lot of money on paying for them not to be in the workplace. So I think there's a big bit of work on the labour market that we need to do. And we also need to improve our skill base. So one of the things when I was immigration minister, there are lots of businesses, and I'm sure PwC represents lots of these, who just can't find people with the appropriate skills, whether it's engineering, whether it's in the IT technology sector, and they need to bring those skills in from outside the country. So that's the first piece. Second piece on family, you need to look at the sorts of numbers that you're going to have for people who meet people of a different nationality and want to bring them to the United Kingdom. Our current system says that you can do that as long as the person can speak English and that you've got the financial wherewithal to support them, and you don't expect the welfare state to support them. And that was controversial when we brought that income level in. People said it was too high, but it was set at the level at which a couple can't claim income-related benefits. And so anyone who says we shouldn't have an income test are basically saying you should be able to import people from around the world and expect the taxpayer to pay for them rather than yourself. And that's one of the arguments we could have about what we require. And then the final area is about study. And this is the one I always used to find very frustrating with my arguments with universities. We don't have a cap of any description on the number of people that can come to Britain to study. As long as they can pay for their course, they can speak at an appropriate level of English, and they're going to a qualifying institution and they're qualified for their course. And of course, students that come to British universities, do their course and then leave, make no contribution to net migration at all, except where that sector is growing. And then you've got the balance between people coming and people leaving. The real issue is a lot of people used to come claiming they were students, and they either weren't students in all these colleges that were importing people but not educating them, or they come and then they don't leave. And we need an argument about what's the test for when a student comes to Britain and when they stay. And personally, if they're staying to take a graduate job or to start a business and create wealth, I have no problem with that, and the immigration system doesn't. So those are the areas. The final one, which we have less control over in terms of the number applying, is the asylum system. We've obviously seen an increase in the number of claims given the tensions in the world. And our system, we have a robust system. I think the current numbers, we grant asylum to about 35% of those that make an application. That varies clearly by nationality. A lot more Syrians are granted asylum, clearly, than other nationalities at the moment. And we need a robust system there, and we need to stop people using that as a route to come here as economic migrants when they don't have any claims. So I think we have to look at all of those. Those are the factors, I think, that we have to take into account when we're deciding what the immigration system looks like. The thing that comes out of that for me is it's actually quite complicated, and it's not as straightforward as some of the rather glib sort of soundbite suggestions you sometimes hear thrown out. So I'm afraid an Australian-style point system polled well, but actually wouldn't contribute to controlling migration at all, which is why I'm very pleased that the Prime Minister has rejected it.
Well, we're going to come on to the Australian point system and other options if we don't like an Australian point system in the next section. I want to ask Madeleine. We've basically had a sort of, thanks to, you could almost argue the sort of, safety valve, maybe the wrong word, but the valve of EU migration, we've actually had a sort of market-based response to labour market shortages, where people can go outside and fill those gaps in the labour market. We now have a Prime Minister who's talking the language of industrial strategies. So how does migration policy meet industrial strategy in a sort of new way going forward?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it gets actually to another of the big trade-offs that the government is going to face when it's thinking, assuming that free movement comes to an end and we're replacing it with some sort of work permit system. One of the conceptual issues they will face is to what extent do we have a relatively simple system with a set of criteria that basically apply to everyone, or do we go for something where there's more kind of attempt to, I don't want to use the word micromanaging because it sounds too negative. I don't really have strong opinions on this, but do we try to channel people very specifically into particular occupations where we think that there's a need for them? And I think particularly after Brexit, because we're going from a situation where there has been very large supply of labour into many different jobs. There's going to be, if we have a work permit system, potentially a massive change to that. And there are going to be winners and losers from that process. And there are going to be quite a lot of different industries that are coming forward making a case saying, actually, it's really important that we should have access to, for example, a new low-skilled labour programme. So agriculture is the obvious area where that's going to happen, but then you also look at social care, you can expect that argument to be made, hospitality, which has become very reliant on EU workers. And I think from the government perspective, there's going to be a real challenge deciding, in all of these cases, there will be good arguments that can be made, but there's also a risk that you end up with an extremely complicated system where you have 50 different policies for different occupations that becomes really unwieldy. I think there's also, when you think about the kind of Australian-style points-based system, which, when it was discussed at the time, no one really knew exactly which element of it was being discussed. One thing that they do in Australia is they have a lot more micromanaging and attempt to channel people into specific occupations. So they have a list, and they say, through our point system, we will have 1,092 medical imaging professionals and 1,000 childcare centre managers, and this type of thing that would be quite alien to what the UK has been doing so far. But I think that there will certainly be some pressure to move in that direction, and it'll be interesting to see how the government comes down on it.
So, going to Lindsey and Jill, I want to bring you in on this question of sort of specific sectors with skill shortage. Mark offered quite an interesting vision, I thought, of sort of complementary policies almost, of perhaps a bit sort of reducing levels of migration, but at the same time doing things to increase the supply of UK labour by getting employers to train people up, look again at people with disabilities maybe excluded from the labour market. So what about some of these crunch sectors that we're going to see which are extremely dependent at the moment on migrant labour? Do you see a way of sort of, how the government might manage those sort of crunch shortage sectors? Lindsey?
So I think there is absolutely shortages in those areas, but to Mark's point, we have to look at kind of why are there shortages. So we've been talking to huge amounts of companies post the vote, and there are some who say, well, they have sort of 80% reliance on EU migrants to fill their roles. They're not particularly skilled roles, and so I think those companies do need to be challenged as to, well, why are you so reliant on EU migration? Realistically, does an EU person make a sandwich better than a British person? Or, to your point, could some of those roles be filled by some of the people who are unemployed currently? But I think to add to that, and then when we look at those sectors and if we look at the business as a whole, the reality is even more nuanced than the point you were making, Mark. And I think you're absolutely right. It's not as simple as kind of, a lot of people say, oh, it's immigration. You've got all of the areas you talked about. But business need migration for a whole range of reasons. So some of it is about skill shortages. Absolutely, they simply can't find the skills. And if you talk to the engineering or oil and gas sector, they really struggle. And even if you said to them, okay, you must rely on or train up British workers, that's going to take them a good sort of 7 to 10 years to get people to the same skill level that we have people at now. But the reality is that business is changing, and the reason why they want people who have different skill sets, different cultural background, is not always as simple as I want someone who's got a specific skill set. Often, if we look at PwC, one of the things that we value hugely is the fact that we have an incredibly diverse workforce. And that helps us internally challenge ourselves and be better, and it helps us when we're talking to our clients. So if the only people we can recruit from are British workers, we're going to have a very British focus on everything we do, and that's not necessarily the right thing. So I think, when we're talking to our clients, one of the biggest challenges they find is that the system is too simple. And actually, even if you look at something like the Australian system, it's too simplistic. And what you do need is you need that nuance, you need those different levels. You need the ability to come and say, hey, look, I'm a massive employer. I need to bring this person. He doesn't fit into any of these little categories, but for my business, he's essential. And realistically, if you are a massive employer, does the government need to be doing 1 million checks on that you've sourced that right person, or that you've advertised a job in the Job Centre Plus to find this person that you've maybe, spent 5 years looking at in terms of their career history? So in terms of those specific sectors, I think it's about taking a step back and challenging why they need them, and some of them do, and then looking more widely at why business wants to recruit migrants across the board.
Jill, do you want to come on that?
Yes, I mean, I concur with kind of other speakers that our migration policy has to kind of run concurrently with a look at skills policy. Let's put that on the table, I think. Food, intensive agriculture, packing, food production is one sector that's very dependent on migrant labour, some of it seasonal. And there are reasons that those jobs can't be filled by kind of the domestic labour market. A lot of them are in comparatively sparsely populated areas. In the referendum campaign, we had very high leave votes in the Fenlands and some other areas of intensive agricultural production. And that was associated with immigration, people's concerns about immigration. And I think a future immigration policy, as well as looking at flows into Britain, matching skills with needs, looking at refugee protection, also has to address the impact of migration on particular communities. We need a workable migration impacts fund. The last Labour government brought in a small migration impacts fund, which didn't really, it wasn't really very well spent. And more importantly, when it was spent, nobody ever kind of mentioned what it was spent on. This government has, it's brought in an NHS levy and has committed to a workable migration impacts fund, but hasn't yet introduced it. So I think a future immigration policy has to deal with the impacts of migration and also has to address integration. We don't really have an integration policy in England as well. And it's only when you address impacts and integration that I think you'll get broader support for migration and an open society.
Mark, do you want to come in very quickly on?
Just very briefly, to throw a thought out there, really. One of the issues, Jill's absolutely right about the impact in communities. One of the things that just strikes me, though, is that communities, the private sector responds very well. You don't generally read stories in parts of the country where there have been significant numbers of migrants. You don't generally read stories about queues at Tesco's because the private sector supermarket hasn't arrived to serve them. But you do read stories about queues at GPs and people on waiting lists. The public sector generally isn't very good at quickly responding to changes in population. And that's not just migrants coming from outside the UK, that's also true in an area where you get internal migration. So one of the questions is actually how do we get the public sector and the public services, so schools, housing, because that's controlled by the planning system, and the NHS, be better at responding to changes in population. I think if the state could do that as well as the private sector does, a lot of the public concern about changes in population would actually be reduced.
That's a very interesting thought. I mean, there are different views in different regions about the desirability of immigrants. We've got the Scots who are quite keen, I think, to have more migrants. We've got Sadiq Khan saying London is open. We've got other areas clearly which feel that they've got too many. And I think that Migration Watch suggested that we might actually try to differentiate a bit more regionally between sort of capacity to absorb migrants, which is of course the thing the Australians do as well. I mean, they sometimes direct you to go and work in a country town or whatever and stuff like that if you do there. So comment on the scope for regional differentiation.
We have touched on that, but not in the way that you imply. Right. I don't believe in directing people to particular parts of the country. We're not that sort of country. We're not the Soviet Union of old or Eastern Europe of old. People come to this country and they're free really to go wherever they like. However, we do say that we need to manage those coming in for work. We do believe that you come to work here, you have a work permit for it, and only if you meet certain qualifications with regard to your own qualifications. But before, can I just go back a little? And we seem to be skirting around the fact of why we're having this discussion today. Brexit really was, I think, one of the most momentous decisions that this country has taken for generations. One of the principal reasons why people voted the way they did was immigration. We do need to manage migration from within the EU when we're going to be out of it. And that I think, is important. Secondly, impact funds, brilliant. I think, of course, the government should help people to integrate, but you can't start there. That is really halfway along the path. You've got to manage numbers first. And thirdly, no one is suggesting that this is a zero-sum game, that somehow controlling migration is really an end to migration. I mean, that's simply daft. What we need to do, and I hope we're going to do, is actually manage EU migration in the way we have tried to manage and met with some success, I have to say, Mark. It's not all failure, as some people have suggested. The government was actually getting there until overtaken by flows from mainly from within Europe, where the numbers doubled within a couple of years. So really, I don't believe in directing people. The Lib Dems came up with that policy 6 years ago. I don't believe in directing people to particular parts of the country. I do believe in managed migration. We've got to think of a system that now will include those coming from within the EU, but generally there's work to be done on bringing numbers to more manageable levels.
Okay. Just wondered whether any of our panel thought there was scope for devolving migration policy, whether it's to Scotland, London or whatever. Does this remain a UK policy? Does everybody think it
has to be a UK policy, unless you're going to have internal borders. This is the nonsense of the Scottish system. If you just allow one part of the UK to control migration, then I'm afraid people who come to that part of the country will move. And one of the complexities with this, I'm afraid, I slightly agree that having a very simple system doesn't work. As someone who's had to work on managing this, as soon as there are lots of people in the world who want to come to the United Kingdom, some for good reasons, some for bad reasons. We have to manage and control the system. As soon as you have a gap, there are huge numbers of people who will exploit it. If you could, for example, just go to Scotland with very little control, then huge numbers of people would go to Scotland and then move to the rest of the UK, and the UK wouldn't have a migration system. So I'm afraid it has to remain a UK reserved matter, because otherwise you simply don't have a system. And I'm afraid I don't see any way you can do that if you're not going to have internal borders in the United Kingdom,
Jill,
which I wouldn't want to see.
Yeah. Jill.
I mean, we do actually have a precedent of a kind of subdivided migration policy, in that the Fresh Talent Scheme, the Scottish government was allowed during the last Labour government to keep its brightest and best university students under a Fresh Talent Scheme, which England wasn't. There are ways that a migration policy could be regionalised, as has happened in other countries, in that jobs, visas could be attached to particular employers or particular jobs. But I think it would be quite difficult to enforce, and there would be kind of other labour market consequences. So I think don't dismiss it. It's one of the cards on the table. But as Mark said, there are some real challenges in implementing it in practice.
So hold that thought. That's very interesting in moving us into our second section. Any very quick comments from the audience? We've got mics. Yeah, any very quick, just comments, just one-liners? Ian, and then back there.
Nobody has yet mentioned Northern Ireland and the Irish border. This may be coming up later in the discussion, but it seems to be an extremely intractable problem.
Okay, we're going to come to that in the next section, but good reminder there. Any, yeah, just back there. Yeah,
I think, yeah, Simon Briscoe. I think we've got a hint of it in Mark Harper's comments, but I think I would just make a plea that short-term migration is considered as part of this policy as well as long-term migration figures. I mean, the statistics for long-term migration are the ones that everyone focuses on, but this sort of revolving door of short-term migration, I think, goes quite a long way to explain why sometimes long-term migration might not be very high, but there is pressure on services. If you constantly have lots of people coming to do the same job for 6 months, 9 months, they don't count in the figures, but it's extra people on the ground after the services.
And is there real evidence, Simon, that they use a lot of public services? Because you'd have thought those are sort of people that barely touch public services.
Well, I'm not sure there is much evidence. I mean, part of the problem is we don't have any. I mean, Madeleine might well correct me, but as far as I'm concerned, the quality of the figures for short-term migration are appalling. And okay, so I'm a bit of a lovely North London family, but because of my French wife, we have this constant. I mean, this is maybe just a personal plea. We have this constant revolving door of French people coming to stay with us. So we've got a household of 4, but the average size is 6. Because there's this never-ending flow. Now, I haven't got a problem with them coming, but those people are just never counted. But, they do put pressure on public services and private services.
Okay. Madeleine, there's a really interesting question. I'm going to move to the next section. Is whether we have the migration statistics we need to enable us to make good policy choices? And do we actually have the data telling us the right things?
So I do a lot of work with migration data, and I'm always going to want more. And so I'm never going to say, actually, we're in good shape. I can work with what we've got. I think, if you compare it to other countries, the UK does actually have pretty good migration statistics. The types of analysis that we can do, for example, following people through the migration system, looking at how people switch from one visa to the next, that's completely magical compared to what you can do in France or the United States. So I don't want to be too pessimistic. Obviously, there are some issues with the data that we have. And part of that, I mean, there are some issues with the data themselves. There's a lot of data that's not being exploited in the way that it could be. I think the big example there is the HMRC tax records. There's a lot of really fascinating information that we could potentially get from those records, looking not just to immigration, but also integration. How are people doing over time? We could track their wage growth over a period of 10 years if we wanted to. So I think there is some more work to be done. I think there's also a question about how we use the statistics that we have. And there are we're putting a very heavy policy burden on data sets that weren't necessarily designed for it. I mean, the obvious example is the net migration figures, which, at the aggregate, there are debates about this, which I don't necessarily want to get into. At the aggregate level, if you're talking about overall net migration, they're probably not too bad. But when you're trying to then fine-tune policies on specific routes, looking at, okay, what exactly is happening with students or with family members, you end up essentially kind of reading the tea leaves of these, based on the survey that does have quite large margins of error, and where you're not going to be able to tweak this policy here and see it magically transform in a year later into the statistics that you want. So I think, yes, we can improve the data, but we also need to be realistic about what the data can tell us.
Excellent. We're going to move on to the next question now. So our next question is, I hope, what are the legal and administrative options for reducing immigration? We've already had some sort of brief excursions into this territory, so we'll sort of pick up from there. It's quite interesting, Alp, that you were referring to the relative success of the government in controlling non-EU migration. I wonder if we might just start off. Perhaps a question again to Madeleine. I mean, what lessons do you think we might take from how we've controlled or managed to control, or in some other people's, maybe not so successfully control non-EU migration in recent years? What do you think the lessons are that we should take out of that for our options going forward?
I think one lesson is that you can't necessarily expect a particular policy to deliver the same numbers of people over time. In that if you have a policy and it stays in place and nothing changes, on some years you're going to get more people, on some years you're going to get fewer people. And I think there's often a difficulty in understanding why that would be the case. People assume if numbers go up, it had to be because policy became more generous. The big example of that, of course, was EU migration. We had the same policy, which was free movement, and we had a massive increase in the number of people. Now, obviously, that's an extreme case. That's going to change. But I think there is a broader lesson for when we're looking at non-EU migration policy or a kind of similar system applied to EU citizens. It is going to be possible to make very big changes to the immigration system and to the numbers of people coming in, but it's not going to necessarily be possible to say this set of policies will lead to exactly this number of people. And one of the reasons I think there is a trade-off to some extent. We need to think about what is it that we are trying to control, because there's a kind of mathematical relationship between you have a trade-off that you can't escape between specifying a particular number of people and specifying the criteria that are going to admit them. And you actually can't. This is a mathematical relationship. You can't do both. And so if you're very keen to have a fixed number of people, so 20,700 people coming under tier 2, you will not be able to also say, and the salary threshold will be X amount and it won't go above. You end up losing control of some of the criteria that you use to admit people if the criteria have to automatically change to catch up with the number. So I don't know if this is kind of too technical a point, but I think that it's not to say that you can't, I don't want to say that you can't reduce migration. You can, and there are lots of ways of doing it. But I think we need a little bit more of a mature approach to every time the number goes up slightly, kind of jumping on the back of the government saying, why are you being so lax? Or every time the number goes down saying, this is a great victory for the efforts to control migration, because actually a lot of the smaller fluctuations in the numbers have nothing to do with policy. It's the other factors that are driving them, the kind of economics, exchange rates, all of these big macro factors that affect migration.
So Alp, actually, I might turn to you here, because you have got this desire, you've sort of stuck with this net migration idea, the 100,000 a year, below that would become more sustainable. So what mechanisms do you think we should sort of start to think about using to control?
Two areas, EU, non-EU. Non-EU first, just going back to the data and really the lack of trust and faith in what we hear. I agree. frankly, we should do better in producing the right data for knowing exactly where to tackle the problem. The indications are, for example, with non-EU, that only about a third of those coming in for studies ever leave. We need some clarity on that. If you look at the number of national insurance cards issued, compare those with the International Passenger Survey, there's a huge disparity. If you look at the Foreign Labour survey, that again suggests that many, many more people are actually living in this country than the official statistics would suggest. That is non-EU. With regard to EU, well, if you apply the same sort of criteria that we do and have done since I was an immigration officer in the 70s, to those coming in to work, and limit it to those with certain skills going into certain jobs, earning a certain salary, then we believe you can reduce at a stroke something like 100,000 people from those in the net migration figures from the EU at the moment. So there are two distinct areas to tackle what I see as the problem, and indeed do it in a way that allows all the skills, all the people that have the right to come here to indeed enter and have a free life. The second thing is asylum and illegal immigration. We have done we do very little in making sure that those who do not qualify for asylum, or indeed those who come in illegally, actually eventually leave. Figure of 35% of those who apply for asylum actually being given refuge formally in that sense. So that leaves 65% who, by and large, don't leave. We've got to do something about that. Over the past 15 years or so, the average annual figure for those forcefully removed is about 5,000, has remained around 5,000. Well, that in itself shows that there are people without a right to be in this country who, frankly, are not being removed. So more effort there.
So, Mark, we've got this sort of disjunction, haven't we, between the vote to go and when we actually leave and whatever. But Alp is rather suggesting that we haven't used our current powers to the maximum to control migration and remove people and things like that. I mean, so, is there more that can be done within the current system to reduce net migration,
let me try and
control immigration?
Pick up on the points that both Alp and Madeleine mentioned. I think, first of all, be quite frank, on the non-EU migration, where we do obviously have pretty much control of all the policy levers, I'd say three things. First of all, we have controlled it because actually the numbers, certainly the numbers coming to Britain, fell quite significantly when the coalition government came to power in 2010. It has then ticked up a bit afterwards, but it's actually the net numbers still, I think, a little bit below where it was back then. And you also have to, of course, compare with what would have happened if we hadn't had the changes in the migration policy that we've had. And given the strength of the British economy, creating more jobs than the whole of the European Union put together, it's not surprising that more people employers have wanted more people to come to Britain. The second thing, I think, is you do have to think about the relative economic position, and I hope that our economic performance continues, but I would hope that it wasn't as relatively so good, because I would hope that the Eurozone was actually able to create some jobs, which would be quite nice for the huge numbers of young people who are, 60% youth unemployment in some European Union countries. So I hope they would do better. That will clearly have an impact. On the point that Alp said, one of the real challenges here is most people who come to Britain and who are here without permission don't come here illegally. They come here legally and overstay. And one of Alp's points is a very good one. One of the not sensible things for us to do is have to use a huge amount of taxpayers' money to put people through a very complicated legal process and then to forcibly remove them from the country, because it's incredibly expensive. What we actually want to do is make it much less easy to be in Britain if you're not here lawfully. In fact, both of the last immigration acts that were passed, 2014 and 2016, were about making it more difficult to be here if you're here illegally. So, for example, last 2 years we've removed driving licences from 20,000 people that have no right to be here, which makes it very difficult to be here. You lose an identity document, you can't drive legally. We've made it much more difficult for people to have bank accounts. We've saved about £100 million in fraud. You know, it's actually quite hard now to be here. That will impact on the number of people trying to stay here illegally, and will make it much less hospitable for people who are effectively breaking our laws and our systems. And I think that's actually what you need to do. You can't control it all at the border because people are not coming here illegally. On the point about asylum seekers who make a claim and we don't find that they have the right for refugee status, we do actually remove a very significant number of them. Either they go of their own volition with some support. There are a significant number of people we do remove. There are flights every week that take people back to countries when they don't have a claim to be here. It is true, there are countries where it's difficult for us to remove people against their will, where they haven't got a claim for protection, but for example, they don't have an identity document, or that country won't help get them returned to their country. And those are very challenging, and you have to work those through. And I think you have to make the system better. If you don't have a system that people have confidence in, you won't get anyone welcoming genuine refugees if they think it's a way that people can game the system. So I think a robust asylum system is how we make sure that we can give a warm welcome to people who are actually fleeing persecution.
Jill, you just want to come very quickly on.
I wanted to come on in the issue of kind of enforcement. I think we have to kind of resource the Home Office properly, both in terms of kind of dealing with visas for people coming in and enforcement for people that we want to get rid of. In our August report at British Future, we kind of calculated that we spend £28 per head on our immigration control in this country.
Per person who lives here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that enough? I don't know. It's probably not enough given that we're leaving the EU and more people will come under our immigration control. The MAC, the Migration Advisory Committee, could perhaps be tasked to decide how much we need to spend on immigration control, and perhaps we need to drop the target of making immigration self-financing by 2019. The other thing that I wanted to come in very quickly on is this tendency of government to overpromise on immigration control. We have a problem. Government then talks tough. It overpromises. The net migration target is your classic example of overpromising, which we failed to meet quarterly, and reminded the public quarterly that we've failed to meet it. So our workable future immigration system, I think, needs to have less tough talk and less overpromising in it.
Okay, that's a very interesting piece of policy context. Lindsey, do we actually have if we leave the EU, are there any other legal barriers to what we can do to migration? Do we have completely free rein on what we can then do on EU migration?
So it depends on whether or not we leave the EU and the customs union.
Yeah.
But in theory, yes, if we completely walk away from it, then we're subject to some restrictions. So Irish migration tends to be one of the highest numbers, and actually there's already existing legislation to allow Irish nationals to come over and vice versa. So you're not going to remove that population of people coming over. And obviously you've got the existing people here. And I think, despite the fact that government haven't yet committed that those individuals will be allowed to stay here, I think it's very unlikely that they won't. But I think if coming back to the point you were making around our border, the challenge we have in the UK is how we police migration. So we do the majority of our policing at the border, and a lot of other countries do the majority of their policing once you're in the country. So if we look at Europe, So even within EU migration, yes, there are some people here who've come here and are, exercising their treaty rights, absolutely. But once they're here, once they've come in, it's quite hard to then to know that, particularly if they're not accessing particular services. And to the point around matching up with HMRC, I think that would help a lot, because then you could demonstrate a lot more what people are actually doing. So I think that that's challenging to completely change how we police our border unless there's a huge injection of cash. And that's one of the challenges. I know that, now as the Home Office are trying to look at a new policy, how do you create a system for immigration that doesn't require everything to be done at a border control, because then everyone's going to be in queues for 50 years every time they go back from the holiday, which is also not going to be attractive. So it is a very challenging thing that we unfortunately have self-created a more challenging issue, which comes back to kind of the point the gentleman made over there about the Irish border as well. That all feeds into it, in that effectively you can come into Ireland and then that's your border control, completely separate country. So
I want to, while you've got the floor, Lindsey, one of the questions we've had tweeted at us was about the rights of EU people who are here. Obviously, there's a lot of concern, not least from IFG staff who are here on European passports. They may not look necessarily as though they're here on European passports or sound like it, but they are. What legal rights do they have, and what should they be doing? I mean, I'm signing quite a lot of nationality applications for colleagues who want to get British passports, or people applying for certificates of residence. What rights do people who are here have?
So one of the things that concerns us is the fact that people won't necessarily have been exercising their treaty rights. Students are the ones that concern us particularly. So they're here, they're studying, but it's not as simple as just coming over and going to university. To fully comply, for example, you also need to have comprehensive health insurance. Now, I think if we did a survey of every EU student in the UK, we'd find that probably 50% of them had taken out comprehensive health insurance. I'd be shocked. So I think people need to understand what is actually meant by exercising treaty rights. It's not simply enough to just decide that you want to come live in the UK. There are steps you need to take. So we are recommending that people, if nothing else, look at the process and consider making an application just to sort of protect their position. Although their position is already exists once we leave the EU, that's protected under EU law, and unless the government novates it over, which we do expect. So I think people should be more aware of what is their position. If they can apply for citizenship, that's a very personal choice. There are wider implications. Often you can't have dual nationality, and a lot of EU countries don't allow that, particularly once we leave the EU, so Germany, Sweden, for example, and there are tax implications. So yes, I think people need to be more aware and consider things, but citizenship is not always the automatic kind of solution, I think. And also, if we had, the 3.2 million EU nationals here suddenly all applying for citizenship as well, that might help on the net migration figures if they then all leave. But, I don't think that's necessarily the solution.
And how reassured can people be that they've met the residence test, that if you're over 5 years, you're likely to qualify for permanent leave to remain, or what is that?
Again, it's not as straightforward, and that's why we do completely understand why it hasn't just been a blanket. Everybody's here, so some people aren't exercising treaty rights. There are very complicated rules if you haven't just been here for the full 5 years working, for example. So to us, it makes sense that it isn't just a blanket. Everybody can stay, but I also, at the same time, know how unreassured. Similarly, we have a lot of EU staff within our organisation, even within our team. So it's how do you find that right balance between just giving a blanket yes to giving that reassurance?
Okay, I want to be projecting forward actually now onto the sort of
Can I just comment on that, please, Jill? I agree with what Lindsey says. Firstly, there's something called the Vienna Convention on International Treaties, 1969, which we've all signed up to. I'm not sure if the French have, but mostly signed up to, which says that any rights and privileges you acquire as a result of a treaty that your country has entered into, you don't lose, you just don't acquire new rights and privileges. So if you've acquired the rights to remain in a country, then you remain in that country. And the whole business of threats to EU citizens who are already here, frankly, is something that has, by and large, been raised by Remainers who really gave this as one of the reasons why we should be staying in, because of the uncertainty it would cause. There is uncertainty, and perhaps the government ought to make it clearer, and I'm sure the government will make it clearer, Mark. But at the moment, we mustn't also forget that there are Brits living in the EU and working in the EU as well. So whatever happens to EU citizens here, I think it's only right that it should be enjoyed by Brits living in the UK, in other EU countries as well.
Okay, Lindsey, do you want to come in very quickly? So I want to look at what the future system might look like.
Just very quickly on that Vienna Convention point, you're right to the point that the Vienna Convention applies to the party that signed up to it, but it's Britain that signed up to it, not EU migrants who are here, so it doesn't apply to them. So the Vienna Convention does exist, but it will not help the EU migrants who are here.
Mark, what's coming very quickly?
Just very briefly, I mean, look, this is complicated. First of all, there are EU nationals that are not here that would be entitled to be here anyway. The Irish citizens, obviously, through the 1948 Act, they're completely entitled to be here, regardless of whether we're in the EU and we vice versa. The big thing is this, is that first of all, you can't make this a blanket rule. For example, there are EU nationals in Britain who we do want to remove because they're currently in British prisons. And if you had a blanket rule that every EU national currently in Britain could stay, we wouldn't be able to remove them, which we want to do. So there are people that are here that we don't want to stay, and we want to be able to remove them. And so it is complicated, and the Prime Minister's made it very clear that she doesn't see any case for someone who's here lawfully, who's working, having to leave, but it isn't as straightforward as having a blanket rule. And we also need, as the primary duty of the British government, is to protect British citizens, and we also have to think about the millions of British citizens in the European Union. We have to make sure when we leave, they're properly protected, and we have to make sure, and I've no doubt that they will be, but we can't just take that for granted. It's the British government's job to look out for British citizens abroad, make sure that their rights are respected, and I'm sure they will be, and therefore there won't be any problem with EU nationals in Britain. But I accept it's uncertain for them. I mean, it's one of the reasons, I mean, cards on the table, I was in favour of us remaining. This was one of the reasons, because it has thrown a lot of uncertainty up in the air. But I just don't think there's any way around that. There isn't some simple blanket way that you can deal with it. You just need to work through it carefully and sensibly, and I'm sure we'll get to a sensible conclusion. But it is going to be a little bit bumpy for people. I don't think there's any way around that.
So that's about the people who are existing, who are here now, and what we might do about them. If we're looking forward as to what a new UK migration system might look like, we heard some of the considerations that should inform it. Just want to turn now into actually, how you might turn that into practical policy. We had a lot of debate during the referendum about Australian-based point system, which sounded very good. There was one on the shelf the Australians are conveniently prepared earlier for us, but now we've heard that doesn't really necessarily work for the UK. So I just wondered if we might sort of think about what a new system might look like. Madeleine, if you sort of look around the sort of world, you've said you can either control a number or you can have criteria-based system. Is that basically the only set of choices you have, or how would you go about thinking about what a new system might look like?
There are a lot of choices that would need to be made. You have the basic selection model, and there are essentially three mainstream models. You've got free movement, which is very likely to go. Then you've got the points-based system, or you've got a work permit system. Based on what the government said, it seems pretty likely that we're getting a work permit system. But that's only, when there was a discussion about this a few weeks ago, that it was discussed as if this was a radical decision, which it's not. The big questions are, what does that work permit system look like? And how is it designed? And there, I think the questions are going to be how, who's eligible and at what skill level. Are we going to have any sort of replacement for the kind of low and middle skilled immigration that has been coming from Europe? These are some of the sectors I mentioned, agricultural programs. We've had an agricultural program since almost going back many decades until 2013. It was only closed down because there was deemed to be sufficient supply of labour from within the EU. So those will be very big questions. I think there will also be some really important questions around to what extent we're relying on temporary versus long-term and potentially permanent migration. If you look around the world, a lot of the low and middle skilled worker programs, particularly low skilled worker programs, tend to rely on temporary migration. And there are various reasons for that. It's a little bit more politically palatable, especially if people are concerned about kind of how are these people going to do 15 years later? Will they still survive in our labour market? But there are some trade-offs about whether if you're relying on this constantly rotating pool of people, do you lose something in terms of their skills, the ability for these people to have learned English? There are concerns about social cohesion. So I think that is going to be a big question about what the system will look like. And then I think the other big one is, will there be reciprocal arrangements of any kind? Are we simply saying the EU now, this is an issue that's not, once we're not having free movement, this is an issue that's just not really on the table for migration, except perhaps some kind of reciprocal deals on access to visa-free travel? Or will there be maybe extensions of working holiday maker programs of the kind that we have with Australia, which is a reciprocal agreement? Will there be some sort of hybrid? All of those questions, I think, will be quite important as well, and will have a big impact on what that system looks like.
So, Jill, what would you be sort of thinking of any of these options that are coming through? I'm particularly interested in this idea that you go to more temporary migration, which obviously seems to be at variance with the idea that what we want are immigrants who integrate well. As if you're here on a 6-month visa or a year's visa, you're less likely to try to integrate.
I mean, I think there are ways of integrating people who are here temporary through their workplaces, through relationships in their workplaces, and as many of them are students, also through the activities of universities. I wanted to say something about kind of timescales. I mean, I think it's going to be a number of years before we are able to move towards this kind of ideal immigration system, if we ever get to that, because we've got a lot of things to think about in terms of Brexit negotiations. The status of people who are here, which has been mentioned. British Future has convened an amazingly cross-party inquiry to look at ways of securing their status and to look at administrative issues. I think in terms of Brexit negotiations, while the referendum results mean that free movement as it stands will go, I think it's highly likely that EU nationals will get some kind of preferential treatment if we don't go down the hard Brexit pathway. So what happens in their negotiations will inevitably affect what will happen afterwards. And we're not in the kind of position to kind of make decisions now. But I think the point that I want to make most of all is whatever we move to, we need public support for it. We have to marry kind of business needs with greater public consent than we have at present. And I think we should be involving the public in policy-making decisions in the way that the Canadian government is doing so. Canada, at this moment, is running a national conversation on immigration using polling, citizens' panels and surveys to get get public opinions. And I think if you ask people about what they want, they would be much more nuanced than Daily Mail headlines sometimes shout. At British Future, we found that while about a quarter of people are rejectionist in terms of immigration, and around a quarter are generally comfortable with current levels of migration, most people fall in this middle group that we call a kind of sceptical majority. But if you engage the sceptical majority properly, you will find that they're much more constructive and supportive than opinions.
The public engagement question is in our last section. We want to come on to that. But before we move on to that and get others' comments on that, I'm just interested, both Mark and Lindsey, about what you see as sort of actually feasible options for a future system. Particularly interested in sort of the implications as well for government. I mean, we may slightly lighten up on the path of deficit reduction, but public expenditure is going to be under pressure. Don't want to be employing armies of new bureaucrats to do all this. Nor necessarily do we want to be imposing massive burdens on employers to comply with new migration requirements. So I just wondered if you'd like to comment, Mark, on what you think might work going forward as a sort of sleek but effective migration system.
Well, I think the first thing is, my own view is, and I think the government's made this clear, free movement, anybody who still thinks that's going to happen should just not waste their time, because it isn't. The referendum result was very clear. I think there's no chance that free movement as it currently works is going to remain. The second thing, the most obvious thing, is rather than invent a completely new system, I mean, clearly we're going to take, I think we're going to take broadly what we do for non-EU citizens and use it for EU nationals. The important thing, of course, is we don't have to treat EU nationals as a lump anymore, as in the same thing. We can have different views about people that come from different EU countries. They don't have one nationality. They might have an EU passport. We don't have to treat them all in exactly the same way. You know, they have different income levels. You know, we can have different views about them, and potentially in our negotiations, we don't have to have an EU negotiation. We do have to have that, but in terms of some countries, we could have potentially different arrangements with different countries, and different countries have different stakes in our system here. There are clearly a lot more Poles here, and the Polish government will have a view about how we deal with migration from Poland and Poles that are here. We can have different conversations about that. For business, I think you want a system that broadly works the same as one we have now. I don't think businesses want to have two completely different immigration systems where they have one set of rules with people depending on which country they're from. I think they want a consistent set of rules. Now, the question is, do you get from where we are now to the new system in a big bang approach, or do we do it over time? You know, do we allow, you know, is there some sort of transitional process? Those are going to be the things that come out of the discussions we have. But I don't think we're going to want a completely separate system, a system that broadly works as it does now for non-EU migration applied to EU nationals, but not necessarily in a way that's the same for every country. We might have schemes, you know, the low-skilled employment comes from particular countries. If you take the seasonal agricultural scheme, most of those people are coming from former Eastern European countries and the EU2, Bulgaria, Romania. So potentially you could have a scheme that allowed people from those countries to continue coming to do agricultural work on a seasonal basis. So I think there's lots of options, but I don't think we want to invent kind of another system. We take the system we've currently got and extend it to everybody that wants to come to Britain, not just those from outside the EU.
So Lindsey, from the other perspective, what system would sort of work there?
So I do agree with Mark that business wouldn't want to have a separate system. I fundamentally disagree that they would want to have the current system, because I don't think anybody likes the current non-EU system. And the reason why it doesn't work is very simple, in that what's happened is, in this effort to have simplification and a points-based system that technically we do actually have, even though it's not a points-based system, but it is called a points-based system. And what you've got is you've got a set of rules that applies equally to a takeaway who maybe wants to hire a business development manager. And I say that because that's always the example that's given to me when we speak to the Home Office, as it does to PwC. And what you've ended up with is a system that doesn't work for either process and requires too much resources to try and manage that. So there's something like, I can't remember the current number, 30-odd thousand companies who have sponsor license under Tier 2. So that means they're choosing to sponsor someone. Of those, about 80% of people have one migrant. So it might be their chief executive, and they have to have a sponsor license, go through a fairly rigorous process, you know, as is correct. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have, you know, checks before they hire those people, but then they have to maintain that sponsor license and, you know, keep up with all of this for one person. And then on the other end of the scale, obviously you've got the massive employers who want to bring in a lot of people, and within that you've got a very large majority of people within the IT sector, and then another group. So to just then put EU into that same system without looking at that system, I think would be a mistake, because I think there's a good opportunity to make that a better system for business. And actually interesting, that's something that had kind of been on the agenda before all of this happened, in the MAC consultation that took place just prior to the change, one of the questions was actually how would you redesign Tier 2 if you had the opportunity? I'm paraphrasing slightly, I can't remember the exact question. But I think there is a good opportunity to have one system and to have a system that works better and to have a system that takes more account of the nuances within why people use migration. Yes, there are going to be low skilled and some kind of sector scheme or particular countries make sense there.
Lindsey, if I may say so, speaks a lot of sense, and no one's suggesting that the existing system is perfect. However, if you are looking to have the sort of skills that industry claims it needs, business says it needs, and you look at those who've been coming in to do those jobs over the last 10 years, it's averaged around 25,000 a year. So you can actually have a system that brings in the people that you want. Secondly, the people who are really coming in looking for work, who are going into the low-skilled, low-paid jobs, are the vast majority of those coming in, and we're talking about EU. So if you have a system that excludes those, that will have a huge impact on the numbers coming in. And finally, intracompany transfers. I'm not sure whether you were referring to those, but there is no suggestion that there is any change or limits to those that companies like yours can bring people from around the world for their expertise and to develop them. So it's perfectly reasonable to have a system that brings in the skills and expertise that we require and manage those numbers at the same time.
I'm quite interested. I just wanted to throw in one of the questions that we had on Twitter, which was somebody talking about, if we look at Silicon Roundabout and the sort of creativity. I think they mentioned Spanish nationals who were flocking in. We know why people are coming from Spain. This economy is tanking there and will tank there. But to come in and bring their sort of entrepreneurial flair into London. They may not come to a big PwC who's got big administrative systems to cope with applying for loads of visas for people. But actually, is there a danger that these systems would exclude people who come in and bring entrepreneurialism to the UK? Some of the stuff that sort of, say, Rowan Silver's been talking about the need for sort of London to maintain that creative flair.
Yeah, and I think, that in that area, Tech City, and Silicon Roundabout, they have been crying out for years to say that the current system doesn't work for them for exactly that reason. It's a lot of administrative burden on a small company for a starting point to then sort of, have to do all of the work needed to get a visa and to get the right people. And if there are 5 people in the world who can do this particular piece of programming, should you have to advertise their position in Job Centre Plus to prove that there are 5 people in the world, which is currently what they have to do to be able to bring those people in, because you don't want the takeaway business development manager being able to kind of, argue that they need 10 business development managers. So I think that it is important to distinguish between why people bring people to the UK. So even, intercompany transfers are bought for different reasons. Sometimes it's to fill a skills gap because someone may be going on maternity leave, or because your business growing. Sometimes it's because you want to give those people those experience. But similarly with graduates and new hires, if we look at PwC, at our graduate programme, we already cannot hire graduates into, overseas graduates into Northern Ireland because of the minimum salary requirements. So we don't hire anybody who is into that area, which is a shame and something we would like to do. There are a lot of very good overseas graduates who want to live in Northern Ireland, can't do it. With the increases in salaries that are going in, a lot of our regional offices are now going to be cut out. Now, we're not a bad payer, as PwC. We're not generally considered to be on the lower end of skill, but we can't hire some of the people that we want to because we're not deemed to be paying enough. So to the point around, people come in and they have the right skills, there's a fairly arbitrary decision as to what constitutes skill, predominantly driven by the MAC, which is all to do with salary. And salary is not necessarily a proxy for skill. And a lot of other countries look at it in different ways better.
Now, I know you want to come, Jill, but Lindsey mentioned the magic words Northern Ireland. And Mark has already said that, you know, Irish citizens, common travel area, we've had that for ages, predating our membership of the EU, and that will survive. But this question that Ian raised has come up a lot, which is how on earth can we reconcile ending free movement with maintaining the common travel area and stuff like that and manage migration? Now, outside Mark, you told me this was easily soluble.
I think this is actually the big problem, it appears, because we have about 100 million people come to Britain every year on visits, right, for travel and holidays and all those kinds of things. Most of them leave. So, and I don't think we're going to be talking about, for EU nationals, insisting that they all become countries where to come to Britain on a trip for a holiday, you have to have a visa. So people are still going to be able to come and go as they please. What we're talking about is whether EU nationals can stay and take a job or study at a British university. So I really don't think the fact that a German national can go and travel to the Irish Republic and then go to Northern Ireland, well, that's fine. You can go to Northern Ireland. The fact is he can't legally take a job. He wouldn't legally be able to go to a university in Northern Ireland, and we have controls that would stop him doing those things. The fact that he can go to the country, I don't think is a real problem. If we didn't have visas, actually there would be no problem with them just getting on a plane and flying to Northern Ireland anyway. So I think this whole cross-border thing is a bit of a nonsense, and I really don't think it's an issue. And both the British government and the Irish government have always worked incredibly closely on the border and visa issues. I know when I was Immigration Minister, I worked very closely with the Irish Interior Minister. There's very close cooperation between the two countries on sharing data for people coming from outside the EU. So I really don't think this is actually, in practice, a real problem that people will find. It's a bigger problem for trade, for bringing goods across, but for people, I don't actually think this is an issue at all. I think people should be reassured.
Separate session when we look at reintroducing customs checks, if we leave the customs. Oh, you agree? Anyone dissent from Mark's view on...
I agree as well, and I think that actually we have a little bit of a problem in this country, which is that the debate, people find it very difficult to distinguish between the visa requirements for travel and visa requirements for work and residence, and there's a huge difference between them. And the idea that just because someone doesn't need a visa to come, I mean, we already have Americans don't really need a visa to come here, and we don't have a massive, as far as I'm aware, we don't have a massive American illegal immigration problem. So it's, you know, you have to keep these things very separate.
Okay, let's not break our consensus. I want to quickly just pick up any comments at the end of this section. So just very quick, one sentence or almost tweety comments. So Candice will move around with the microphone. So we'll come here, and Kerry, so if Kerry wants to bring it down here, go there. Yeah. Lady here. Thanks. Yes. Just tell us who you are. Very quick comment.
Alex Murdoch. I put this through on an email, not Twitter, I'm afraid. But I just wondered whether I go to America a lot. I go in on an ESTA visa. It's very straightforward, and now it takes me approximately 15 seconds to get. I counted it last time. Would that be something that we could use for the EU, something like the American ESTA program?
But this is an ESTA for tourist travel. This is just for tourism.
That's it. It's an ESTA for tourist travel and movement, but essentially what it does is it says you are known and you come, and it's straightforward.
Okay, we'll put that to Mark. Mark, you're on notice. Yeah, yes.
Liz Banks from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. I'm not going to ask it as a question because those aren't allowed, but I don't think what the panel has covered is what the impact on the UK domestic labour market would be if we have a new immigration system where it's possible to bring foreigners in for skilled work, but not for low or unskilled work. What would that mean for the opportunities available for British workers if they can...
Okay, that's a very good non-question. Yes, front row.
The panel hasn't talked about what scope there is for using sponsors of immigrants in order to enforce the system. Greater penalties for businesses or universities which don't see that their people leave at the end of their permit.
Okay, so let's just take a couple more comments, then we'll just give the panel a very quick chance to react to that. And I just want to then come on to some of these things about flanking policies and the conversation we need to have.
Thank you. My name is Teodora Barca. I work for DCLG, but I'm speaking in private capacity. I know this is a very British conversation, but 3.3 million EU citizens could potentially bring something to the table. I'm also Romanian, and I believe EU citizens have contributed, and they feel they are contributing. And during the Brexit campaign, it felt like EU citizens didn't really have a voice. I also feel that a couple of years ago, when I came to the UK, I felt there were some issues with how EU citizens had the sort of ease of tapping into services. Potentially, the access to the UK wasn't the problem, but sort of tweaking that system of having that access to services could be done to improve immigration rather than saying, oh, we're going to limit immigration.
That's a very good question. We're going to come on to that, so brilliant question. Okay, so let's just ask that. Lindsey, should we do more, Robin's question, or non-question, should we do more to penalise employers or universities who don't make sure that people leave?
Again, it's not as straightforward as kind of that, because there's a whole range of universities. There are a lot of very good universities who make best efforts. Part of the challenge is, how do you prove someone has left? We don't have exit checks in the UK, and I appreciate exit checks technology is a controversial subject. But if you can't demonstrate that someone's left, I mean, unless you physically walk your students back to the plane and see them on it, it's quite hard for universities to do that. There are some universities...
You may discover that they haven't moved.
Yes, exactly, yes. And then, you know, what are you doing then? They could hop off the plane. So I think it's very hard to put that burden always on the employer or the university. Some of them do huge amounts of work, you know, are very, very compliant. There are companies and universities and colleges, probably rather than universities so much, out there who are very kind of lackadaisical about the rules, and absolutely it's right that a focus has been on them. And, you know, I think particularly with colleges, the government have done an incredibly good job over the last, 5 to 7 years on really cracking down on those colleges who were frankly abusing the rules massively. And, you know, I think if we look back to where that was, where like that time when the tier 4 student process came in, it's a completely different picture. But there's a limit to how much you can ask employers to do. So, the points you made, Mark, about it's harder for people to be here. It is, but all of the burden of those checks is on employers or is on companies. So it's on the banks to check that the person is opening the account has the right process to be able to open an account here. It's on landlords to check that the person they're renting to has the right to live here. It's on employers to check that they have the right documentation. And if we just look at that employer's point, again, if we're looking at small or medium-sized business, if you've got one person who may be like the secretary to, the CEO, and you're asking them to conduct right-to-work checks, and there are thousands of different documents out there, and then they have to go, looks okay to me, I think you have the right to work, it's not clear on the documents. I mean, we struggle even in PwC to do this, and we give intensive training, and we obviously do it, and we spend a huge amount of money and process on it. We have a team internally of it's like 4 or 5 people whose job is just to deal with immigration for PwC, because they're doing things like the right to work checks and all the other kind of sponsor duties that we have, because we take it incredibly seriously, as we should. So I think there has to be a balance between focusing on those companies who are going to ignore the rules anyway, and yes, you can have a fine of whatever, I think it's £20,000 now every time you have an illegal worker, but unless you can focus on those people who probably aren't going to follow the rules anyway. But again, it comes back to the point earlier about linking up with HMRC and other things, because people who don't pay the right tax or national insurance are probably going to be the people who are employing illegal immigrants anyway. So I think there's better use of government data rather than pushing all the responsibility onto employers.
I want to get on to our last thing. Mark, just this very quick point on...
So that gentleman's question, I mean, an ESTA type system, which is actually relatively easy, I've used it myself this summer when I went to the US, is very straightforward. I mean, there is an option for some EU countries. We might not actually require any kind of visa at all. I mean, if you're coming from France or Germany or something like that, depends on what systems we have for exchanging data with them about people who are an actual risk to the country. We might not require a visa at all. I mean, those would be, I think, some of the conversations.
US, Canadians,
no, we don't.
or
So those may be some of the conversations that we have as part of the negotiations. Just picking up Lindsay's point on the balance, I think she's absolutely right. You need to get a balance and ask people to do reasonable amounts of work, which we do. I think there is a lot we can do with data, and in fact the government started doing this, and I know when I was immigration minister, when we started looking at HMRC data, it's absolutely fascinating, because you found immediately that there were a significant number of students, for example, who were here on visas which didn't enable them to work, but who were working, and to be fair, they were paying tax, but we discovered they were working, or we discovered they were working 300 miles away from where they were allegedly going to university, and managing to do that on a daily basis. So I think there's quite a rich seam of data where we could help with some of this enforcement work, and make the lives of employers easier. And we should always continue to try and make the system more straightforward, which is, I think, it's never going to be fixed. It's always going to be an ongoing process.
Can I just make a quick point about that Esther thing? To have easy process for French and Germans to come, and maybe a little bit more difficult for some of the other EU countries. We have to remember that actually EU rules are that we have to treat them all exactly the same, otherwise they will impose visa controls on us. And they do take it reasonably seriously, in that they are in discussions with the US now about restricting US nationals to come in visa-free to Europe because they impose restrictions on Romanians. So again, it's the kind of the practicality of, do we as Britons want to have visas every time we have to go to Europe, just so that we can make sure that a Romanian who comes on a plane...
It's not really in their interest either, though. There's a lot of talk about stuff like that. It's not going to be in the interest of France to insist that every Brit that goes to France has to have a visa, because then lots of Brits might not go to France to spend their money there.
Okay, I want to go on to our final set of questions, which is just, it's a point Jill started to raise, about how do we engage the public, and actually are there sort of other things like, you know, access to public services, welfare benefit, which is sort of the flanking policies. We haven't got very long for this, so I'm just going to sort of ask each of the panelists to answer that sort of question about two questions really. First, how do we actually engage all the people who think they're players in this debate? So we've heard about migrant voices, so the people who are here, legitimately here, think they've got quite a big stake in this. Employers, people representing sort of sectors who may not be formally organised in those ways. How do we really engage them in a sort of better conversation about migration? And secondly, what are the other sort of policies that we need to be looking at to make sort of whatever level of migration we have? Because even under Migration Watch's future, we're still at 100,000 net coming in, so people will still experience concerns about that. So what are the sort of accompanying policies we need to look at? So I'm just going to go round the panel. Madeleine, how do we sort of, you know, any thoughts about how we might engage, or actually what are the sort of pinch point areas where we need to look for flanking policies?
I was going to say, I'm just the humble stats girl, so I'm not going to address the question of how we engage the public. But I mean, I think in terms of the other policies, one of the things, and I think this is something the government does actually recognise and talks about a fair amount, is that it's not just immigration policy that is important in managing how the whole system of people coming to the country and then what happens to them after they're here. There are lots of other areas of policies that are implicated. Obviously, education and skills. One of the reasons, definitely not the only one of the reasons that we've had a lot of demand for people coming from Eastern Europe, for example, in construction jobs, is that there's a lot of concern about whether the apprenticeship system is really working in construction and whether people can gain those skills. That you then have, you know, the whole area of public services. I think Mark made a very important point that that these are, you know, we do in theory control these things too. And the Migration Advisory Committee, I thought, produced a very interesting report when it was looking at whether there's a shortage of nurses that needs to be filled with non-EU citizens coming to the UK. And they certainly, you know, they looked at the data and they said, yes, there is a shortage of nurses, but it's because the government hasn't planned domestic supply very well. And so, yes, we'll put them on the list, but actually this is a problem that could have been prevented. And I think that there are lots of these areas where there's an interaction between what's going on in immigration policy and what's going on in other policy areas. And it's very difficult in government, which is big and complicated and has specialists in different areas, to bring those things together. But to the extent that it is possible, it definitely needs to be done.
Oh, how do you think we should go about engaging all the sort of interested parties in the debate, and where else should we be looking for?
Firstly, I think we have to differentiate between the clunkiness of the system and doing something about that, and actually changing the system or doing away with it simply because it doesn't quite work the way we want it to work, or it poses difficulties. This is really in response to what Lindsey had said. A lot of the time it is about the system not working the way it should, and we can do something about that. It's the government's job to consult, and I think that's what it's doing. We had a massive, biggest consultation ever for months and months and months, or at least weeks and weeks and weeks during the referendum campaign. So it's not as if the people haven't voiced their concerns and said what they want very, very clearly. We engage the people in doing these sort of things, be it Romanians, bună dimineața, be it Czechs or Germans or whatever. They have embassies here. If there are concerns about their nationals, they can make their points very forcefully, and they do, I know, with the Foreign Office, with ministers, and the rest of it. What we mustn't lose sight of is that we do need to get migration down. And really, that is what I think should be our main objective, but doing it in a way that doesn't harm or hinder our trade, our business, our universities. Universities do have an important role to play. And going back to what Lord Butler said, actually the universities, they shouldn't be given the whole responsibility of making sure that people who attend them leave, but they should certainly play a much bigger role in making sure that happens than they do at the moment. And there are all sorts of ways of doing that.
Jill, you raised the sort of issue of actually having a better public conversation about immigration. But do you think there's sort of other areas of policy that, in a sense, we ought to be throwing in, whether it's welfare, access to rules on access to public services, etc.? I mean, you know, Simon's example of his never-ending flow of French people coming in. Not sure how worried we are about that, but...
I mean, absolutely. I mean, we've already talked about having a workable migration impact fund, but I think we need to think about our integration. We've got an imminent review of integration policy, the Casey review, that's due out this autumn, and I think it's a real opportunity to grapple with things like ESOL. Our English language policy is a complete mess. Regulations change after term has begun, and the Skills Funding Agency, I don't think, is really politically accountable. So integration and social, I mean, kind of having opportunities to kind of meet and mix with migrants in the park, at the school gate, is part of an integration policy. I think we need to think about things like social segregation in our lives. I've talked about the need for a national conversation, but I think we need to think about the whole narrative about migration in this country. The tendency to kind of problematise and then overpromise and fail to meet your targets is one big way of damaging public trust. I think Brexit also risks a very polarised political debate about migration, that you've got freedom of movement on the one hand versus closed communities on the other, that the referendum was solely about migration, that those who voted leave largely did so because of migration concerns. People voted leave for a whole range of reasons. And I think as we progress towards leaving the EU, we need to talk about migration in a different way, that we can have an open community without having freedom of movement as we had before. So less polarised debates from the very top of politics.
So, Lindsey, how do you want to be engaged in the conversation going on?
I would actually slightly change the question, which would be how should government engage? It should be how should we all engage? Because I do think, to your point about the responsibility, actually I think where employers and universities and everybody who kind of benefits from migration does have a responsibility is to be better about explaining why we need migration and why it is beneficial and what is kind of the reasons behind all of that. I think it's very easy for everyone to kind of hide behind closed doors and let government and think tanks have the conversation, but ultimately we're the people who benefit from it, and we should be out there talking about that and being engaged and not just leave government. I would say just one thing, government is actually in this area pretty good actually about engaging with business in our experience. I'd say it's probably one of the best areas where they do genuinely go out and try and have a conversation with business, and and Mark's been to many things at our offices to have conversations with business, so I would give them plaudits for that.
So we're good at business, but maybe slightly less good at having the public conversation. So Mark, final word, how would you be advising people in government now about to make all these decisions about what the future shape of a regime should be? How should they go about developing this, and what are the other sort of policy areas? You, I think, presented quite an interesting agenda at the start about the other areas which we ought to be looking at, setting off now, in fact, to sort of set for those things. So what would your advice to your colleagues be?
A few things. I would agree without that the referendum was a very clear signal that people want a system that's more controlled and actually want to treat EU and non-EU migrants in a consistent way. I think just having it as part of the normal political discourse, I think we've moved quite a long way over the last 6 years and actually being able to talk about this subject in a sensible way without people. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that if you talked about migration, people just said you were racist, and we have actually moved on now, and we can actually have slightly more grown-up conversations about, as we have this morning, about skills and diversity and the different benefits that migrants bring to the country, and I think they do. And I certainly, when I was the immigration minister, I used to spend a considerable amount of time setting out the benefits of migration, but the fact that you have to have a properly controlled system and seeing it from both sides. So I think that more grown-up conversation, I think, needs to continue, and everybody involved in the subject should do that. I think public services, we should continue making them more responsive. As I said, the danger with a sort of migrant impact fund is there are clearly pressures in communities, and there are clearly areas where you need local authorities, for example, to have funding. But the danger then is you sort of see migrants as a problem, and actually most people that come to Britain as migrants to work, they are working and contributing and paying taxes. They are using public services, and sometimes public services don't respond quickly enough, and that's sort of the public services' fault, not the migrants, and we ought to try and make our public services a bit more responsive. The final point is, I think, in that conversation with employers should set out what their requirements are, but we should push back a little bit as well. As I said, there are significant numbers of people in Britain who are going to be more challenging to get into work. There are not that many people now who are just straightforwardly unemployed, looking for work. Most of the people now who are out of work have some kind of further challenge. Either they don't have the skills and they're not really in the labour market, or they have a health condition or a disability, which means they're absolutely employable, they absolutely want to work, but they will need some extra support, whether it's through a system the government has like Access to Work, or an employer may actually have to put a bit more effort into getting them to be job ready and contributing. And I think we have to push back a little bit on employers and say, you're now not going to be able to import quite as many people as you would. You need to look at some of the people we've got in Britain and give them an opportunity. So the final point, which flows from that, and it comes back to what Madeleine said, is control of migration and getting the right people in Britain to contribute isn't just the job of the Home Secretary and the Immigration Minister. It's actually the job of all government departments, all ministers, and all of those contributing to public policy. And it needs to be something at the back of everybody's mind about what are the impacts on their decisions about migration and controlling it. You can't kind of put it all on the Home Office, I think, and that would be my kind of final plea. It's a job for everybody in government and actually the public, employers and universities and so forth going forward. And it's not a straightforward task.
Right. I think that's an excellent point to end. So I promised you'd end at 10:15. I've more or less delivered that. So could I just ask you very quickly to thank our fantastic panel for all their insights?